The background for the book of Esther, and now we're going to go through the text. But I want to do it kind of a different way. I want us to look at each of the main characters in the text and see how they relate to each other, how they relate to the culture that they're in, and what's going on with them. With narratives, it pretty much lays it out. Like, I could go verse by verse through it, but you also know how to read. So I thought, we'll go through it this way, and then that would give you the background needed so that you, as an inductive student, can go through the text and say, oh, okay, this makes sense here, and this makes sense here. All right? So we're going to start with the first character that shows up, and that's King Ahasuerus. And like we said, he has another name, and it's Xerxes. And the book opens with Ahasuerus having a huge party, celebrating something. Generally, it's thought to be that it was a great victory in battle. And these were long parties. It was quite typical in Persian culture, and actually to this day, that when they have a party to celebrate something, it may go as long as a month. And the king had all of his friends and all of the important people in, and it was all the men, and they would eat and drink and eat and drink and eat and drink. And then it has that Queen Vashti had all the women into her quarters, and they would have the same thing. They would have a party, and they would have their own thing, and it was separate. Again, in Persian culture, the women of the wealthy, they lived in a separate place than the men. And the men would call for the women when they wanted them. All right, so that's important to bear in mind. So Ahasuerus was quite a proud man. He was quite arrogant. He really believed that he was the leader of the greatest kingdom ever to be on the earth. And so he lived that sort of a life. He lived a life of extravagance. So that's Ahasuerus. He's a pretty simple guy, and actually he comes into the story primarily as the one that keeps the action moving, keeps things going there. Then we have Queen Vashti. Now, she wasn't the queen, she was just the top queen. And Vashti, it seems, is a very proud woman. She must have been very beautiful because the king chose her to be the primary wife, his primary queen. And when she was asked to come into the king's presence, she refused him, and then that caused her to be cast out of the harem and to be cast aside as the primary queen. Now, why did she refuse to come before the king? There's some thoughts on this. One thought is that the king wanted her to come wearing only her crown, and she refused because she wanted to come in wearing clothing. That might be so, except that the Persian culture among the wealthy was that they really didn't mind if they had clothes on or didn't have clothes on. They were just kind of indulging themselves. But that could have been one of the things. Another thought is that she did not like taking orders from the king. She was an extremely proud woman. And that's generally one that people go with. She was just too proud. She didn't want to take orders from the king. And we see that by her refusal to come before the king and his men, the men are quite upset because they're like, oh my gosh, if the queen refuses to come before the king, what about our wives? They'll start refusing to do things that we want. And the king was stuck between a rock and a hard place. So he had to come down pretty tough on Vashti and had her expelled from being his primary queen and living in the harem. Then we have Heyman. Heyman is the bad guy. He is the one, he is all full of himself, and he wants to be a man of extreme power and extreme authority in the Persian Empire. Not just in Susa, he wants to be a big deal. And he will do almost anything to make it happen. He'll give the king whatever he wants. He will say yes to whatever the king wants said yes to. He'll say no to whatever the king wants said no to. He's just like most politicians. He wants power, he wants authority, he wants influence, and he will do whatever it takes to get it. Then we have Mordecai. Mordecai, he is the uncle of Esther. He is a Jew, so that means he's living in exile. He has some authority. He has some respect because he had saved the king's life at one point, and that shows up in the book. But he also is a man who does not follow the dictates of wanting to be important in the kingdom or wanting to impress the king or wanting to give the king what he wants all the time. Mordecai is a man who does what he feels is right, and he doesn't really care what happens as a result of it. Then we have Esther. The book opens with her being a young woman. She's a virgin. And after the king has expelled Vashti as being his lead queen, he wants another one. So they bring all the beautiful virgins of the kingdom to the king. And they spend time in the harem getting beautified and learning how to present themselves before the king. And then each girl spends one night with the king. And if he likes her, then she becomes queen. And if he doesn't like her, then she becomes part of the harem. And she may never see the king again, or he may ask for her to come into his presence again. And just so we know, it's not based on love. It's not a love sort of a thing. It's just pure attraction. If he finds her beautiful and desirable, then she's what he wants. So here's Esther, a young Jewish girl. And Mordecai tells her, don't tell him where you come from. Don't tell him about your heritage. Why? I don't know. The scriptures never tell us. But she listened to the wisdom of her uncle. And the king found her very beautiful. And he put on her head the crown of Vashti. So she became the head queen. Those are the primary characters in this book. So after Esther becomes queen, and that is in chapter 2, then we see that Heyman in chapter 3, Heyman wants to be seen as extremely important. And he goes to the palace every day, and every day everybody bows down to him except Mordecai. And that really, really irritates Heyman. And he gets very, very upset about that. He's thinking, what can I do? How can I bring my vengeance on Mordecai? And he realizes Mordecai is of the despised people. He's a Jew. And so he tricks the king. He said, King, there's a group of people in your kingdom that don't worship you and honor you and respect you to the level that you should be loved and respected and worshipped. We should do something about that. And the king's like, oh yeah. Because the king, he's pretty easily flattered. He's like, yeah, I think we should do something about that. And Mordecai said, you know, my king, what if you passed a law that anyone who does not worship you, who does not honor and respect you in the way that you should be, those people should be killed. And the king is flattered. He's like, yeah, I'm kind of a big deal. Yep, they should be killed if they're not going to do that. And so he passes that. And the Jews in the kingdom are all in an uproar. Now there's another little side story going on. Mordecai does not bow down to Heyman. He does not respect Heyman. And Haman's going, that's not good. He's like, you know what? I'll show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to get more respect than Mordecai can. He can't even ignore me. So again, Heyman comes before the king. And he says, oh, king, may you live forever. What would you do for the man who has done great service to the king? What would you give him? And the king's like, I think I'd let him ride on my horse and have somebody go in front of him saying, here's the one that the king honors. And then everybody would bow down. And Heyman thought, that's a good idea. And Haman's like, yes, that's a great idea. I think you should do that. So the king goes to bed. And he can't go to sleep. And so he has somebody come and bring him the records of the kings of Susa, of Persia, which must be an incredibly boring read because he figured that would put him to sleep. And as he's going over it, he remembers an incident where Mordecai saved his life. Someone was out to kill the king, to assassinate him, and Mordecai saved the king's life. And the king realized, hold it, I've never done anything for Mordecai. I should honor him. And then he thought, maybe this is who Heyman was talking about. What a wonderful guy Heyman is, to be thinking of that. So Heyman comes before the king, and he said, King, have you thought of what I suggested? And the king's like, oh, yes, I have. And he said, go get Mordecai. And Haman's thinking, oh, this is good. He's going to make Mordecai bow down before me. And then the king says, okay, Mordecai, here, you will sit on my horse. And Heyman, you're going to lead the horse through the streets of Susa, and you're going to declare this is how the king treats those that honor him. And it's really quite funny. So there's poor Heyman having to declare that Mordecai is greatly honored and held in esteem, when actually that's what Heyman was looking for himself. So at the end of that day, Heyman is upset. He is furious, and he goes home to his wife, and she's like, what's the matter? And he's like, oh, that Mordecai. And she said, you know what? Maybe you should build a gallows. And while all the rest of the Jews are being killed, you can personally take Mordecai aside and you can hang him on this gallows. He said, that's a great idea. So he built a gallows. He built it so high that everyone in the city could see the top of the gallows. And that's what he was going to do. He was going to take care of Mordecai, himself personally. So we have then Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai hears the story about the king's law that the Jews are to be killed, and they're not to defend themselves. And Mordecai gets the message to Esther. And he said, you were called to this position perhaps for such a time as this. And she said, okay, have everyone pray and fast. She said, because the king has not asked for me in a very long time. And it was against the law of the Persians that anyone could go into the king's presence without him calling for them first. So if she went in without him calling her, she could end up killed. But she was willing to do it. So all the people fast and they pray and they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and Esther goes before the king. And she said, will you come and you bring Heyman, and will you come and you have dinner with me in my rooms? And he said, oh, that would be very nice. And Heyman's very happy and he's very proud. And he goes and tells his wife, oh, how wonderful. Look, I'm just an amazing guy. Even the queen wants to hang out with me. It's great. So they all come in for dinner. And the queen says, oh, king, may you live forever. There's been a law that's been passed. Then my people, they will all be killed. And the king said, who did this thing? And she said, you, O king, you passed that law. And he's like, oh, yeah. And he said, this is how I will change it. Your people can defend themselves. For one day, we'll have this only be on one day, and they can defend themselves. They will not be annihilated. They will not be made poor. P-U-R. It's a root word for purify. They will not be purified. They will not be taken out. They can defend themselves for one day. And then he said, who told you this? Who brought this? And she said, it was Heyman. And the king went out and he was furious. And while the king went out, Heyman falls on Esther's couch and he's like, please, say something to the king. He's going to kill me. It's going to be horrible. It'll be terrible. And the king comes in and he sees Heyman laying across Esther, and he's thinking what most husbands would think when there's a strange man laying on top of his wife. And he said, Heyman, you are dead. And he hangs Heyman on the gallows that Heyman built for Mordecai.